I entered the Richmond Hotel ballroom wearing my transit authority badge and heard my husband tell a live audience that the woman beside him had saved him from a marriage that erased him. Garrett stood beneath the station banner beside Mallory Brenner, using the warm voice thousands of listeners trusted every afternoon. I was there to represent my agency at a city services event sponsored by her hotel, not to check on him, and my name was printed on the guest list. When the room turned toward me, Mallory's face changed first, because the wife she believed had agreed to separate was standing one row from the stage. Garrett stopped talking, but the microphone remained open long enough for his breathing to reach every speaker and every listener still tuned in. I looked at his wedding ring, then at Mallory's sponsor badge, and asked, "Which part should I correct first? That we still live together, or that you texted me this morning about our anniversary dinner?" Mallory stepped away while Garrett reached toward the control table and ordered someone to cut the feed. Nobody moved quickly enough, and the silence after my question traveled farther than anything he had planned to say. Mallory tried to explain that Garrett had told her our marriage ended months ago, and the shock in her voice sounded immediate. Garrett pulled me aside and whispered, "I was going to talk to you after the show," as though timing were the only problem. I opened his morning message, asking me to collect his suit and confirm our anniversary reservation. Every detail belonged to the life he was still using. I did not raise my voice, defend our marriage, or help him explain why his private version of me had become public fact. Guests watched him look from Mallory to me, waiting for one of us to make his story workable. But neither woman gave him the sentence he needed. I removed my badge, placed it on the registration table, and walked toward the ballroom doors while Garrett called my name. For the first time in our marriage, I left him standing inside the mess without turning around to clean it. Garrett was home before me, sitting at the kitchen table with both hands around a glass he had not touched. He had built a version where the broadcast was a clumsy attempt to admit our marriage had been struggling. He blamed the station, blamed Mallory, then insisted everything had grown larger than intended. I placed my phone between us and opened his morning message, reminding me to collect his suit and confirm our anniversary reservation. "When did our marriage end?" "Garrett, before or after you asked me to choose the restaurant." He stared at the screen, then tried to separate our public problems from our private routine. The distinction collapsed under his own words, because the man claiming we were emotionally separated was still planning dinner, home repairs, and another year inside the same house. He kept explaining until each new sentence contradicted the one before it. Mallory called from a number I did not recognize and spoke like she needed facts before she could breathe. Garrett had shown her photographs of an apartment and claimed he was preparing to move there. But I recognized his coworker's unit, where he once stayed after a station party. I told her we had never separated, still shared our address, expenses, and daily schedule, then stopped before she could turn me into a witness for whichever version she preferred. The records existed without my permission, and none needed me to make them convincing. Garrett waited until the call ended, then asked me to contact Mallory again and tell her everything had been misunderstood. That request made the pattern clear, because he was not asking me to forgive him. He was asking me to repair the damage before it reached his job. I spent the next few nights with a friend, met with a Virginia family lawyer, and learned how to protect myself without emptying accounts, changing locks, or creating problems. Before turning off my phone, I sent Garrett one message. "From now on, I will not correct any story you choose to tell about me." The next morning, the clipped broadcast had already spread across neighborhood forums and local social feeds. But the station released a short statement claiming the personal story aired with the understanding of everyone involved. I never posted a public rebuttal because the statement itself gave me a simpler path. I emailed the station's legal department, confirmed I had never approved the use of my marriage on the air, and attached the event invitation, proving I had attended in an official capacity, along with the anniversary text Garrett had sent only hours before the broadcast. Those two documents did not describe our entire marriage, but they contradicted the station's claim that I had agreed to become part of his story. Penelope Ward, the senior producer, realized the review would reach her desk before the week was over. So she preserved every planning email and every unedited production file instead of relying on memory. One recording captured Garrett casually saying I would never object because I hated public attention and usually let him handle conversations for both of us. And hearing that sentence explained why he had sounded so confident on stage. Derek Mason suspended Garrett from the afternoon show while the station examined what had happened. Yet Garrett was already telling mutual friends I was using my government job to pressure his employer, even though I had contacted only the station's legal office. The evidence had begun moving faster than the explanations. Garrett kept insisting everything would calm down if people stopped overreacting. But each conversation uncovered another version of the same story. He told Mallory he needed time to protect his job before making any public decision about their relationship. Then called me later that evening asking whether I would attend counseling with him so the station could see we were handling everything privately. I told him counseling deserved honesty, not an audience, because he was asking for a photograph of reconciliation instead of a conversation about truth. The silence after that answer lasted longer than any argument we had shared during our marriage. Before midnight, Mallory sent me a message saying Garrett believed I was refusing to let him leave because I wanted the house and the life we had built together. I answered with a photograph of the separation paperwork my attorney had already prepared, explaining that nothing had been filed only because Virginia required each step to follow the proper process. She read the message without replying. And a few minutes later, Garrett called twice before giving up when I let both calls expire unanswered. For the first time since the broadcast, neither of them could make their stories fit together. Because every version they had told someone else was beginning to collide with another piece of evidence that already existed. Mallory asked to meet at a cafe between downtown and the hotel, where neither of us could pretend the conversation had not happened. She arrived first, twisting the sleeve around her coffee until it tore, then admitted Garrett had told her our marriage ended nearly a year earlier and that I stayed because neither of us wanted to sell the house. I opened my phone and placed it between us, leaving the anniversary reservation, kitchen renovation messages, and his reminder to pick up his suit on the screen. She studied the dates longer than she looked at me, because every message belonged to the weeks when Garrett claimed he was building another life with her. Mallory whispered that he had sworn those plans existed only to avoid suspicion until the divorce became public. I told her I could not explain what Garrett believed while writing those messages, only that he had written them and never mentioned separation. Her shoulders tightened before she asked whether I loved him or simply refused to let another woman have him. I understood she needed jealousy from me, because jealousy would make his story easier to keep. I told her she did not need my permission to stay with a man who had lied to both of us, but she did need to decide what those lies meant. She looked at the screen once more, insisted Garrett felt trapped, and left carrying the same version of him she brought inside. Only now she knew where it cracked. That evening, a local entertainment site published selected messages portraying me as distant and controlling, while omitting lines where Garrett asked me to cover a missed dinner, smooth over another argument, and explain another absence. My agency's communications office contacted me because the article identified where I worked, and strangers had begun directing comments toward the department. When they asked how I wanted to respond, I forwarded the complete conversation without changing a word. The missing messages needed no interpretation, because they showed who had carried the marriage and who had turned that work into evidence against her. Within 48 hours, 2 major sponsors asked the station why a personal story had been presented as something every person involved had accepted. That single question forced the legal department to stop treating the situation as gossip and start reading emails, production notes, and internal approvals. Penelope's preserved messages showed she had warned Garrett not to describe my marriage as a settled separation without confirmation from me. Another record showed Garrett removed that warning before the final production outline reached Derek, turning one careless broadcast into a documented decision that ignored an explicit concern. Derek called Garrett into a formal review instead of another private conversation, and the station pulled every version of the production file from its archive. Garrett insisted he genuinely believed I would never object because I had always preferred privacy. Yet his explanation collapsed beside the email trail, showing he had been warned that assumption was not consent. No one argued with him for long because every answer led back to a document carrying a timestamp he could not rewrite. For the first time since the broadcast, the discussion stopped revolving around our marriage and focused on the station's own standards. The hotel opened its own review after learning the sponsored event had become the setting for Garrett's public declaration. Security footage confirmed Mallory had rearranged seating so she would appear beside him during the live segment, believing she was stepping into a relationship already finished instead of one still legally and emotionally intact. When investigators asked when she first learned Garrett and I were still living together, her timeline no longer matched the messages she had exchanged with me after our meeting at the cafe. The conversation she once thought would protect her became another record that could be compared against everything else. I answered only the questions my attorney advised me to answer and continued the separation process exactly as Virginia law required, leaving every financial and property issue inside the proper legal channels. Garrett called mutual friends, asking them to convince me to reassure the station that he had simply misunderstood the state of our marriage. But none of them could reconcile that request with the anniversary reservation and the household messages he had written only days before the broadcast. Without realizing it, he had spent years depending on me to make his contradictions sound reasonable. And once I stopped doing that, every institution reviewing his conduct reached its own conclusions without needing my help. Garrett waited outside the public meeting room after my agency finished hearing transportation complaints, standing alone with the confidence that used to carry him through every difficult conversation. The moment he saw me, he admitted he needed one last chance before the station reached its final decision. He insisted he had never wanted to embarrass me and only believed people would eventually accept the ending he imagined if he told the story first. I watched him search my face for the expression that had rescued him so many times before, but it never appeared. He admitted his relationship with Mallory had started while his ratings were falling, and he felt invisible outside the studio. Then he quietly added that he had convinced himself our marriage had already ended emotionally, even if neither of us had spoken those words aloud. I asked why a man who believed that still sent anniversary reservations, renovation plans, and grocery lists to the wife he claimed he had already left. He looked down instead of answering because every explanation returned to the same messages he had written only days before the broadcast. Garrett finally asked whether I would tell the station he had honestly misunderstood where our marriage stood. He reminded me about the mortgage, the years we shared, and everything we once planned, hoping those memories would outweigh the emails and recordings already under review. I told him I had never asked the station to suspend him or anyone else to investigate his choices, because the only thing I had stopped doing was confirming stories that were never true. His voice fell almost to a whisper as he asked whether I could ever forgive him. I answered that forgiveness might one day belong to my own peace, but it would never become a way back into my life, because the anniversary reservation, the renovation plans, and the broadcast could not exist inside the same honest story. He nodded without arguing, finally understanding that every institution reviewing his conduct had reached its conclusions without my help. I reminded him that every remaining conversation about our separation would continue through our attorneys, then walked away while he remained exactly where I had left him, with no version of the past strong enough to stand beside the evidence he had created himself. The station's review ended with a finding that Garrett had presented private claims as verified facts, ignored Penelope's warning, and misrepresented my consent. His contract was terminated for violating broadcast standards and sponsor obligations, not because he had been unfaithful. Derek received a reprimand for approving the segment without confirming the claims, while Penelope was assigned to build a stricter review process for stories involving people who were not present. The station aired a correction stating that I had never agreed to the way my marriage was described. The hotel completed its review after and found that Mallory had used staff, seating, and a sponsored event to support a personal announcement. She had also given investigators an incomplete timeline after learning from me that Garrett and I were still living together. The hotel ended her management role and transferred her to a lower position outside Richmond, where she no longer handled partnerships or events. She lost authority because the records showed what she had done after she knew the truth, not because anyone blamed her for believing Garrett at the beginning. Mallory sent one final message saying Garrett had deceived both of us and that I should understand she had been hurt too. I answered that I understood his deception. But her responsibility began when she saw the messages, knew the marriage had not ended, and still sent edited screenshots to the entertainment site. She never contacted me again, and Garrett stopped defending her once he realized the article had become part of the evidence against him. Their relationship ended without me touching it, because it had depended on both of them believing I was the only obstacle. Garrett blamed Mallory for releasing the messages, while Mallory blamed him for choosing her publicly and then asking me to save his career. With no silent wife left to absorb the blame, they had to face what each had done to the other. I completed the divorce through a negotiated settlement, sold the house, and claimed only what Virginia law and our agreement allowed, leaving every consequence where it belonged. Nearly a year later, I was promoted to lead a team improving how our transit authority responded to public complaints, and the decision rested on performance reviews and projects completed long before my marriage collapsed. Wesley Barrett worked beside me on the same initiative, always asking whether I wanted to answer difficult questions myself or let communications step in. That simple habit reminded me how respect sounded when nobody assumed they could speak for me. Trust returned quietly because my life no longer depended on someone else's version of who I was. I saw Garrett one final time after a community forum on responsible media where he was helping a small independent station. When the room emptied, he admitted every recording, email, and text message had survived longer than the story he tried to build around them. He quietly said he finally understood that being good with words never gave him the right to define another person's life. I thanked him for saying it, but told him responsibility could change his future without reopening mine. Mallory never contacted me again, and I later learned she had rebuilt her career in another city. Derek remained at the station under stricter oversight, while Penelope helped establish a production process requiring written verification before personal stories involving identifiable people could be aired. None of those outcomes happened because I demanded them, and each one followed decisions documented long before the investigations ended. Their consequences belonged to their own choices, not to my anger. Wesley and I eventually signed the lease on a quiet apartment after months of ordinary conversations and uncomplicated days together. While unpacking, I found the transit authority badge I had removed on the afternoon. Garrett introduced another woman as the person who had saved him, and I smiled because it no longer reminded me of humiliation. It reminded me of the day I stopped explaining someone else's decisions as if they were my responsibility. Thank you for staying with me through this chapter of my life. And I hope you always remember that peace begins when your own truth no longer needs another person to explain it for you.